morning, friends. Today we are going to start up with another perspective. I think we all have talked about the issue of development of sociology in India, and in that context we try to see that there are various ways in which we can see the Indian social phenomenon, especially when we try to speak about the various aspects. We try to see that there are different perspectives which are meant for understanding the Indian society, and in that framework we try to find that there are certain new perspectives which are coming up, which are giving a new direction to the understanding of Indian society. And in that context, here we can locate another prominent perspective, which of course has its visibility, not very old, but it is going to be very contemporary and relevant when we try to speak about the functioning and the existence of society in India. And here of course I am speaking about the issue of environmental perspective. I think when we try to speak about this issue of environmental perspective, many things comes in our mind, that why we want to study that, how we can see it sociologically in that sense, and apart from that, what is the relevance of this perspective. So this lecture is basically dealing with the basic issues pertaining to the environmental aspect. Especially we try to speak about the meaning and genesis of environmental issues. I think that is the area of concern for many. Then second thing in that sense which we can see is basically tracking the so-called environmental perspective. So we have to see a sort of a trajectory of the environmental perspective, which will basically speak about the historical way in which the perspective has emerged as a sharp discipline, and also it speaks about the various conditioning which has led to the emergence of this perspective. And then I think since we try to make it more sociological or discipline specific, so in that context we will be basically speaking about the contribution of the significant scholar who has made understanding of environmental perspective in a particular framework. And for that we have a celebrated name, that is Ramchandra Guha. He is a prominent Gandhian critic scholar, and he has been celebrated. I think you might have heard about him. He is writing into various weeklies, and also into the various newspapers as a columnist. So in that way I think Ramchandra Guha's understanding about the contemporary issues is very vibrant. And also somewhere we will also try to locate the various environmental movement which have been the part of Indian society. I think this all makes up this package of the environmental perspective. But before that, I think when we try to speak about the environment is not seen as an entity which is in isolation. Rather we try to see that the environment has to be seen in relation to the masses, in relation to the people, and for that we have a specific term, that is the ecology. Now ecology, when we try to see, it is basically seen as the relationship between the man and nature. So what ecology means to us is the interaction, the interrelationship which is there between the man and nature in the various historical phases, and especially if we try to see in terms of its origin. So the word ecology has been given by or coined by the German natural philosopher, that is Ernst Haeckel. Ernst Haeckel has talked about this specific term of ecology, and that which he is trying to speak about in way back 1886, when he has coined the term ecology, which basically speaks about the scientific study of the relationship between the organism and also the surroundings, that is the environment. So, in that way I think when we try to see with regard to the origin and the existence, we try to find out that there is a specific concern about how we have to or what motivate us to study the environment, because ecology definitely plays a crucial understanding of the relationship between the man and the nature. But somehow we also try to be, or we are more worried about that why this particular issue came into existence, or why suddenly the issue of environment has become so lively. So, one thing that comes up in our mind of course is that it has come into the prominence because of the project of modernity. And when we try to see that the project of modernity, it tries to see the age of enlightenment, which speaks about the liberation of man. And this liberation of man has to be seen in terms of how the individual has been seen as, the man has been seen as an individual. And it was a period which also saw certain amount of disenchantment with the lively world. And we also try to see that there was the phase where we have the advent of the scientific temper. So, I think this all notion of scientific temper, the whole notion of development with regard to the modernity, all these things has led to certain amount of intermixing or the sort of relationship between the man and the ecology. And in that way we try to see that the man tries to treat nature with his own rationality, because everybody have their own rationale about how we can deal with the nature. And in that way we try to see that the rationalization which has no limits, the rationalization which can be seen in terms of the myths, the rituals, it can be seen in terms of the bureaucracy, it can be seen in terms of the capitalism in that sense as such, or it can be seen in terms of the path of development. In either way we try to see, we try to find out that there is certain amount of logic which was involved, which has basically been concerned or which has basically emerged with regard to this project of modernity. And such an approach method or such an approach has basically led to the human being for thinking and acting. And here lies the imagination about the environment, the environmental perspective, because everything has to be seen in terms of coherence, everything has to be seen in terms of systematic planning, efficiency, calculations are involved in that sense as such. So, all these things were required to be part of rationality, and how man has to deal with the rationality in the different phases of time, because the rationality of capitalism would be very different from the rationality of the so called bureaucracy or the rationality of the science. So, in that way we have the different ways of interpretation of the rationality, which has given rise to the different ways of looking to the nature. And at this juncture we try to see that there is an emergence of the new discipline like ecology, which basically has shifted our attention towards the new form of conceptualization, especially when we try to see that who is responsible for that and what has made the ecology so prominent. And for that I think we try to have a very famous environmentalism issue, the writing by Rachel Carson's and his prominent work, which of course is known for the emergence of the whole debate of environmental issues, that is the silent spring. Now, this issue of silent spring, which was published in 1962, is a remarkable contribution which has led to the understanding of the environment in a new way. I think the title itself speaks about that spring is always full of what you can say joys, it is full of the playful activities, it is full of the confidence and lots of music. But the title itself is saying it is a silent spring, which basically means that the spring which is part of the nature is not happy, or sometimes we can say that the silence is seen in terms of that it has not come out with the full joyfulness, and that is how we try to see that certain problems are there, and these problems are to be understood in terms of what one can say, trying to relook into the nature, trying to understand the relationship between the man and the nature, and in that way we can have the real understanding of the various seasons. So I think the work itself is speaking about the Silent Spring is by Carson, which of course is a remarkable contribution in the field of environmental issues. Now I think when we try to see that how or where it has come into prominence, the environmental issues, if you try to see, if you try to have the environmental history, we try to see that it constituted basically in the United States. And as we know that United States has reached to level of development at certain period of time, and in the 1960s we try to see that the climatic influence has started affecting certain amount of history, political activism, the young historians which are trying to see the things in a new way, especially if you try to see certain names. We have Roderick Nash looking to the new waves of political activism, and they are basically trying to see that how a specific class is going to oppose what you can say, or not only oppose but also trying to raise the voice, and that is when we try to see that earth is being seen as a biotype, and this biotope earth, the earth as a biotope is basically trying to speak about the fact that it is going to bring about the new level of debate. And here we try to see that the environmental history has come into prominence, especially we have the significant contribution which was visible in August 1972. And August 1972 we saw a special number of Pacific Historical Review. Pacific Historical Review, and this Pacific Historical Review was basically a famous article by Roderick Nash, and which has made a appeal for the special amount of political activism on the issues of environment, and that is how we try to see the debates on the environmental issue has come into prominence. Like I said that we have Rachel Carson's Silent Spring, that was in 1962, but apart from that we also have a very significant attempt which has been made, especially in April 22. We have in 1970s the very prominent contribution, or we try to see it as a special day, that we have the First Earth Day, and this First Earth Day itself speaks about that we are concerned about our planet, we are concerned about our understanding about the nature, and here we try to see that on this particular day, on the 1st of April 22nd, we try to see that around 20 million people in the United States, they came together and they had a large demonstration over the issues of development which are going to be drastic and detrimental to the human race. And later on we try to find out that the American Society, we try to find out that the American Society for the Environmental History was framed. American Society for Environmental History was framed in 1977, keeping in view these demonstrations and in order to address and tackle up the issues of environment. So this particular society was basically working for or concerned about the environment. Now it is also seen as a sort of a turning point in the global framework, because it was not an area of concern for America alone. Rather we try to see that it was a turning point for having the new understanding about the ecology, the new way of looking to the ecology, especially when we try to see, we try to find out that somewhere it also tries to hint that, or it's an alarm for that something which is unintended for the wildlife, for the plantations, for the human health, all these things are going to come up. And as we all know that we had the two world wars, and these two world wars, the first and the second, it speaks about the catastrophic effect on the human population, on the environment, on the plantation, and also on the natural resources in general, because both these world wars, if you try to see, they were at the cost of destroying the nature. Human race is fine, but it also has affected drastically the nature, which could have been a source of survival for the future generation, and that is what make the people concerned about the way to contest politically, legally, and also in terms of popular culture to save the earth, to save the environment. And in that way we try to see that in the last 50 years there has been series of environmental disasters which happened throughout the history of the world, and they basically try to have the non-human nature as the issue of concern. Now the point of course is that when we try to see these issues, I think one important work which we can refer to is the work by Jamieson, and Jamieson was trying to see the issues in terms of reinventing nature. Now this issue of reinventing nature, which was basically seen as those issues which are going to be challenges to the humanity, basically the non-human spheres of existence are to be redefined, or we try to see that the need for protecting the nature, for transforming the society, all these things were part of this whole debate which Jamieson has read with regard to this issue of reinventing nature. Basically we try to see that we have the new way of looking to the anthropocentric issues, anthropocentric concern, where the human being is at the center, and also we try to have that how environment can be seen as an important issue, like we try to become anthropocentric to ecocentric. Now this is a gradual shift. If you try to see, the man-centric issue is now going to be ecocentric issue, because if we can preserve the environment, then definitely we can sustain many societies. So in that way we try to see that the human societies which are to be seen as transforming, they are to be seen in terms of ecocentric understanding. So it's a gradual shift which we can see in terms of a debate, especially we try to see that this is to be seen as an epistemological break, because a shift from man to the environment to the eco was a significant issue. And we try to see that by 1970s lot many debates have been raised which basically were trying to see the environment, environmental problems, pollution, also certain other issues of what you can say the extinct races, the depletion of the natural resources. These things were going to be part of the global canvas. So by 1970s the new form of global canvas was emerging, which tries to debate upon these issues which were pertaining to the environment. Now we try to see that there is also an amount of the radical green thinking. Now this radical green thinking basically tries to see that how we can have the new way of protecting the trees, the green plantations in that sense as such, and it was basically many organizations, the organizations which were not in the mainstreams, they were being put together, they were being organized so that they can raise these issues, and we have a proper disciplining of the environment, which is, I think we all know that we have the environmental sciences which tries to see the so-called environment, community, ecology, climatology, oceanography, and many other issues which are part of the environmental problems. But the point is that these tremendous initiatives which have been taken in the 1950s to 70s, they were trying to make a gradual shift in the ecological model. The first phase, if you try to see, the first phase was basically trying to see the traditional mode of understanding the natural preservation. So the first phase was basically trying to have the new way of the natural conservation and preservation. That was an important concern. Basically we try to see that new kind of environmental consciousness has come into picture. and also we try to see that the new institutional formation like the World Wildlife Fund, and we have many other issues which become prominent with regard to the environmental consciousness. So, this is the first wave which we try to see, and there we also try to see that the science which was being reoriented, we have the radical technologies which are trying to preserve and conserve the nature in that sense as such. Parallelly, we have certain other issues where the small is beautiful. The basic idea in that sense of course is that the small is beautiful by Schumacher is not something which is significant, but every entity is going to be important as such. So, that small is beautiful does not mean that we are trying to ignore the big issues, but the more important issue in that sense of course is that the smallness or the small entity also can play a significant role when we try to see with regard to the understanding of the existence of the society. Then I think another growing concern was the issue of energy, the energy issues. Now, energy issues I think is always a matter of concern because it was seen as a important issue, the priority agenda for the political parties, or even we try to see the nationalistic ideology, where we have the national political parties whose concern was to have a control over the energy in that sense as such, and these energies are to be seen in various ways which are to be derived from the natural resources. Like we try to see that in many parts of the Europe, we have the new research centers, we have the government departments, and also we have the new organizations whose basic concern was to have a kind of service culture among the students and the faculties. Then we also have the fourth phase. The fourth phase basically which is seen in terms of the movement, and the movement which is basically seen as a sort of an organization, the organizational learning in that sense as such, and basically the role of youth. So, the youth mobilization was also an important concern which was been visible by the end of this environmental issues in the last phase, and here we try to see that there is certain amount of crystallization of the institutional interest. We have not only the government or the organizations which are responsible or which are concerned for the protection of the environment, rather we have the role of the NGOs, the non-governmental organizations, the civil societies, and also we have the parallel parties, the parallel partners which also try to see the preservation of the environment. So, I think all these things basically try to see that whatever the transformations which took place with regard to the environmental issues, and finally the era in which we are putting up is the era of globalization, and that is basically the part of understanding how the era of globalization is going to be significant with regard to this issue of environment. Now, here there is one important issue that come into prominence, that is we had the regrouping of the nations. We have the what you can say countries which are coming together on a common front for a common issues, like we all have certain issues which are quite prominent, like the climate change. The climate change was one of the important issue which has been area of concern in the field of globalization, because we try to see that this climatic changes definitely is a growing concern and pertaining to how we can have the new waves, the new way to bring back to the old climatic conditions. Then another significant issue of which we all are aware is the ozone depletion, and that is again a area of concern for everybody. Then also we have the so called preservation of the biodiversity, that is another important issue in that sense as such, which are going to have an impact on the human society. So, all the three issues, climatic change, ozone depletion, and also the biodiversity, all these things were quite what you can say appealing to most of the masses. Now, we have the government, we have the business workers, we have certain other parties in that sense as such, and all of them were trying to work together. So virtually we try to see that the environmental issues which are to be seen as the localized entities, now there is the internationalization of the environmental issues. And this internationalization of the environmental discourse, basically it involves the foreign funding transfers, the foreign aids in that sense as such, the technology transfers, and many other things as such. Like sometimes in India we try to see that the new biodegradable mechanisms are there, like in railways I think the bio toilets are coming up as such. Now this is basically how we are trying to borrow the new technologies from the other countries. Similarly, we have the biodegradable products in that sense as such. We have the ways of not only putting the things into garbage, but more important in that sense of course is that how they are to be destroyed also, so that they could not have the sustaining effect in the future generation. So virtually this internationalization of the environmental issues had made us everybody alarmed and sensitive about this particular issue, and in that way we try to see that this has basically led to a great epistemological transfer, or we try to see that the new wave of or the new consciousness has started emerging with regard to the environmental issues. Now we also have with this the aspect of ecological modernization theory, which is basically by Arthur P.J. Moll, and this is basically a theory of modernization that came in 1996, and the main concern was, or the argument was, that valuable beginning point for analyzing the contemporary reflexive reorganizations and transformation of the production into the ecological criteria. So the ecological modernization theory was trying to make what? It tries to make the contemporary reflexive reorganization and transformation of the production. And what was the center? The center was the ecological criteria. So one can interpret this reflective reorganization of the industrial society and attempt to conquer the ecological crisis. So virtually we try to see that although the capitalism, the industrial society is meant for production, but on the same side it is also trying to preserve the environment. So that is how we try to see. So it is not the profit interest of the organization of the industrial society, but their interest also has to be to have or to overcome the ecological crisis, and that is how we try to see this ecological modernization theory. And this ecological reforms, which has been because of the modern science and the technology, it was trying to replace the new technologies which are going to be more eco-friendly or meant for the ecological conservation. Now we also have the so called economizing ecology. Now this is again important, economizing ecology, which is basically having certain amount of economics and the market dynamics in the ecological reforms. We are talking about not only saving, or we are trying to have the calculations with regard to the production, rather we are trying to have the issues which are pertaining to the ecology. That is, economizing ecology of course is that at the lesser cost of of the ecology, or effect on the human population and the natural resources, we can have the production. So virtually the economizing ecology has an appeal for the sustainability. It is not that all the products are to be manufactured and utilized in one go, rather it should have a parameter of sustainability, and that is how we can have the issue of the ecological rationality, which has been the part of the debate which is meant for economizing the ecology. And also parallelly we have the political modernization. Now, this political modernization, if we try to speak about, is basically with regard to the environmental policies, because the political modernization is not for the political reforms or for the political parties or the reunion, rather their concern was to have certain environmental policies which can make the thing better. So, political modernization also, other than politics, were also trying to work for those policies which are meant for the protection of the environment, and these environmental policies are to be framed, reframed in that sense as such by the state. They are to be executive, they have to be reactive, they have to have certain amount of forceful implementation, because that is the only way we can sustain the environment, and it involves both the mode, the centralized as well as the decentralized mode. It also has certain amount of market regulation in which you can have certain amount of control. Like I think when we go for the market, then sometimes we find that there is no polythene or the polythene bags are missing. Sometimes we feel bad on that, but I think if the political policies are made so harsh or so strict, then definitely we have to go for the other options in that sense as well. So, somewhere the political modernization basically involves that their concern is also for the so called environmental issues in that sense as such, and in that way we have what one can say our common future. Our common future is not my future or it's your future in that sense. Our common future is basically seen as the World Commission on Environment and Development. World Commission on Environment and Development, and the basic idea in that sense of course is that how we can have the retention of the development along with the environment. And here of course I think one very ethical philosophy or the new debate which has come out, which of course has become a prominent work, that is the limits to growth was basically seen as an aspect where the growth are to be seen in terms of restricted sense, means that we can have the so called growth or the issues of growth where the sustainability aspect is to be maintained. So, we have to have the limited needs are to be limited or concise in that sense as such, and these needs are to be seen in relation with the ecology. So, the needs are to be sustained and are to be controlled or managed keeping in view the ecological concerns. Now, we have certain other issues in that sense as such, like when we try to speak about these, what we have talked about is trying to see the environmental concern in the global framework. But when we try to see that these environmental concerns, as I said, are not regional specific, but when we try to move down to certain other issues, especially when we try to move down to the developing countries, and like if we try to speak about the environmental issues in India, I think we try to find out that there are new ways of looking to the environment. Like the environmental issues which have been raised in the West, I think this modern environmentalism was never been part of what you can say the Indian society, especially when we try to see that the scientists or maybe the people in the rural communities, they also had certain amount of sensibility with regard to the environment as such. And on the contrary, we have very significant movements like the Chipko movement, the tribals who try to resist in the Chota Nagpur area, and also the Kerala coast we have the artisans and the fisher folk which were basically trying to have the protest with regard to what you can say saving the destruction of the fishes because of the pollution. So, I think these are certain prominent issues. Similarly, if you try to see in the coastal areas of Odisha, where we try to see that the damage which is happening to the ecology because of the bauxite mining. So, these are the significant what I can say, concerns which have been there in India and which have been timely resisted and revolted also. And it's not that it has been with the civil society, it has been with the elites. I think it has been across the sections of the society, including the tribal, the rural in that sense as such, and also the artisans and the laymen. So the issues have not been raised by the elites or the so called the academia, rather it has been resisted by the smaller segments of the society, the people, the masses in that sense as such. So in India, if we try to see the environmental movement, basically we have in 1970s the prominence of the environmental issues, and it can have the various stages, like we have that the so called understanding of the environment are to be seen with regard to what can say, the Marxian framework, where there is an issue of the ecological struggle. We have the class struggle in that sense as such, where the bourgeois are deviating from the issue of ecology in that sense as such. So we have the Marxian framework for looking to the environmental issues. Then also we have especially this Chandi Prasad Bhatt and Chandi Prasad Bhatt, and his contribution I think is going to be significant, because Chandi Prasad Bhatt has gradually tried to have certain amount of critique with regard to what you can say, the environment, and we have the environmentalism of the poor in that sense as such. That was the debate which has been raised by Chandi Prasad Bhatt, and we try to see that in the West the green movement were motivated with a desire to keep the beautiful places, but here we are trying to see that the environmental issues are meant for the survival of the masses, and we have the unequal competitions, especially we try to see that the control over the fish, over the water, over the pastures, they are basically, we have the unequal competition, because plenty of resources have been there, and you have the people who had the lesser people who are having a control over it as such. So in that way we try to see that the sort of profit making, the urban, how they are going to devast upon these issues of environment as such, all these things in that sense were happening in India, and we definitely have a very different scenario which have been there in the West, but in India we have the different issues. Now we try to see that the peasantry which have been quite significant, especially when we try to see the birth of the Chipko movement, the Chipko Andolan which have been there, and in contrary to that we try to see that it was a what you can say, attempt which tries to have certain control over the protection of the forest, and that has led to certain amount of control. And the basic issues that has been raised is that the hydel projects which are to be instrumented, it should not be at the cost of the nature or the trees in that sense as such. Similarly, we try to have certain other significant work, and if I name some of the people who had contributed significantly directly and indirectly, we have the late Professor A.K. N. Reddy, whose contribution in the field of environmental issues, especially on the sustainable energies, is going to be quite significant. Sustainable energies, basically in terms of the strategies, we have Madhav Gadgil. Madhav Gadgil's contribution again is going to be significant. Then we have this Ashish Kothari. So his concern for looking to the environmental issues in that sense as well. We have many other names, like we have Anupam Mishra, we have Ramaswamy Iyer, who were basically trying to fight for the water management in that sense as such. We have Dinesh Mohan, whose contribution we try to see in terms of the transport, and also we have Ravi Chopra, who is basically trying to deal with the People Science Institute at Dehradun for the rehabilitation of the population. So in that way we try to see that these people, the long list of people, they work on the different areas, especially they work in the field of environment, they work in the field of water management, they work in the field of rehabilitation, or they work in the field of protection of the trees, and many other issues in that sense as such. But apart from these people, one significant name which has to be concerned for the people and for you people in that sense, of course, is the contribution of Ramchandra Guha. As I said that in the starting itself, Ramchandra Guha, definitely his contribution is going to be quite significant. He was basically a historian by training and a biographer also, but he was based at Bangalore, which of course was seen as one of the advanced cities. He has taught at the University of Yale and also has worked in the University of Oslo, and also he has served in various other Indo-American communities. He was a visiting professor at the University of California, Berkeley, and also in his academic career he served as the Philip Roman Professor of History and International Affairs at the London School of Economics. So I think if we try to see Ramchandra Guha's exposure and his contribution, being an historian, and apart from historians, he had served in various places, and in that way his what you can say understanding or his concern about the environmental issues is going to be quite significant. I think if you try to see some of his celebrated works, I think we can have certain names, and one work which I will definitely try to focus more upon, that is the environment. In the case of environmental history, we have the Unquit Wood. Unquit Wood is basically an important work which has been from University of California in 1989. That was one of the significant work, and it was also seen in terms of what you can say a work which was to be seen with regard to the environmental movement in the Indian society. Then you also have another work by him on India after Gandhi. That was also an important work, which is in 2007 by Macmillan Press. Then also his contribution is to be seen in terms of the social history of cricket, because he is a prolific writer in the field of cricket. Also, he has written good commentaries on the cricket in India, and he, apart from that, has been a regular writer in the Times of India, in the San Francisco Chronicles, in the Outlook, and many other works in that sense as such. And also, if you try to see that he's been seen as a writer of eminence, especially he has his contribution in terms of the fictions and also the new fictions writers in that sense as well. That is how we try to see his contribution. Now, coming down to his important work, the Unquit Wood, and the full title says that Unquit Wood is basically with regard to the ecological changes and the peasant resistance, ecological changes and the peasant resistance in the Himalaya. So the complete title, the Unquit Wood, and then you have ecological changes, the subtitle is ecological changes and the peasant resistance in the Himalaya. Now, this work is basically seen as a path breaking work in the study of peasant movement. Especially we try to see, as I said earlier also, that the ecological issues and the resistance did not come from the so called what you can say elite, rather it has its voices from the peasants, from the tribals in the different parts of the country. And especially we try to see the peasant movement which has basically worked against the commercial forestry. So I think if you try to see the issue, the peasant movement which has been against the commercial forestry, it brings the story of Himalayas as a social protest in up to day life or day to day lives, reflecting the Chipko movement in the later phase. Because Chipko movement definitely is a prominent movement, but somewhere it also has some background which has to be seen with regard to this peasant movement, and especially since it has been part of the Himalayan region. So, we have that this economic history of India has to be seen in terms of the trajectory. Especially we have the case study of the history of change in the forest of Uttar Pradesh in India. Especially now we have this Uttarakhand in that sense as such, which has been part of UP earlier, but now Uttarakhand basically was a region where we have the historical analysis of the two hills in the Uttarakhand forest area, where we try to see that how the peasant, they try to resist against the commercial forestry. And the important issue is that this commercial forestry, which has been debated out, was been inducted by the colonial rulers at some period of time, and how it is going to affect the subsistence, what you can say, the subsistence economy or the needs of the local people. Because if we have the commercial forestry, then definitely it is going to have its attack on the so called what you can say, subsistence needs of the people. And this particular issue, which Britishers, they have planned, the British Empire, they try to see that how we can have the wider commercial demands to be met out, and exploitation of the natural resources can be made by restricting the tribals and the peasantry to move into that particular area. So, we have the British India who demand for the increase of the local forest supply, especially the resin and the timbers. The resin and the timbers were required in abundance. We all know that these timbers has been used for the manufacturing of for the laying of the railway lines. The railway sleepers are meant for that as such, and for that you need the wood logs, the timbers in that sense as such, and these things were meant for their own interest, for their own purpose, for the transportation and for the better networking and the connectivity. But they try to have the extraction of these things from the forest, and that is how the problems have come into the picture. Especially we try to see that when they try to have an extraction from the forest, then simultaneously they also have certain amount of resistance or control from the masses in that sense. Means the restrictions have been put upon the peasantry, that how these peasantries are going to be avoided, or they have to take the prior permission while entering into their own land. And with that, what has happened, of course, is it has led to certain amount of protest in that sense as said. And the protest basically is over what you can say, the trees which are to be taken out, that is the lopping of the trees and the grazing in that sense as such, and basically burning of the forest floor with a fresh crop of grass. All these things have been done in a scientific way by the peasantry earlier, but now we try to see that suddenly, because of the governmental control, these things have come into a different framework. This has basically led to certain amount of conflict, and the conflict of course is to be seen in terms of what I can say, one issue of the property ownership. Who is going to be the owner in that sense as such? So, the whole issue in that sense was over, the whole issue in that sense was over the control of the ownership of the land and the forest, over the land and the forest. And we try to see that the developed notion of the private property, when it started coming up with the peasant communities, they try to have certain amount of control, and this has basically led to certain amount of marginalization of the pastures and the woods in that sense as such. And these also has been with some restrictions, with some guidelines in that sense as such. So, the forests are not to be used in the way the peasantry want to use, and the actions were being directed against the state and were not being put by the state in the tone that they want. And Guha has basically tried to see that the colonial records which says that the Indian foresters, they provided the rich sources of information on the exercise of the various forest management by the forest department, and these forest departments were having the new policies against the what you can say the will of the local masses in that sense as such, and this has basically led to certain amount of resistance as such. Now, what British wanted to do, they wanted to have certain amount of hegemony over the ownership of the land, the way they wanted to utilize the land, and also the important thing that comes into the picture is that these lands, definitely the natural resources which are to be utilized by the masses themselves, but now they are going to be utilized by what you can say the so called governmental policies, and in that way we try to find out that there are two parallel which are coming up as such. One of course is the peasants resistance which is going to be visible in the Himalayan region, and we also have the resistance by in the Britain, France, and also in Russia. So, we have the two resistance in that sense as such. In Britain, France and Russia, the parallel of history are forcefully demonstrated in terms of comparison, which tries to have certain amount of historical evolution of the current pattern of the resources. Like we have the present resources at one end, we have also the resistance which were going on in Britain, Russia in terms of conservation over the forest, and the study basically tries to conclude or examine the formation and the action plan which has been worked out, which is to be seen in terms of the Chipko movement. And especially this Chipko movement, it has seen as a sort of a protest which tries to understand the forest history in a new way, especially in the Uttarakhand. It is also interesting to know that the Chipko movement, you have the leaders which were definitely of not the national character, we have the local, we have the national, and also the global players which worked and tries to have certain amount of interventions into this particular issue. Especially we try to see that the state which was being seen both as a political entity and also as what you can say social entity in that political and also like economic activities in that sense as such, and we try to see a great transformation like with the increasing emphasis on the forest in the community. We have an understanding that this encourages the local participation in the protection and the management of the community forest as such. Now, this is of course one side of the story. Now, this particular social forestry in India was being done traditionally by the foresters, by the people in that sense in the form of communes, and this forestry now is basically having the notion of local participation, understanding of the indigenous knowledge, and also the acceptance of the local rights by in terms of an access to the forest people in that sense as such. So, virtually we try to find out that the linkage which has been there between the trees, between the people, the local masses in that sense as such, and also the state, all the three people, all the three categories in that sense, they were in tussle with each other in that sense as such. So, virtually we try to see that this whole notion of Chipko movement and also the peasant resistance which have been there, it involves on the one hand what you can say the state which has to be seen in terms of the economic development, but also it has the political policies in that sense as such. So, state which is seen as a hegemonic what you can say entity which tries to hegemonize in terms of the rule making, and this state basically tries to what you can say overpower the control from the hands of the local masses. Especially we try to see that the peasantry who consider themselves to be the part and parcel of that particular society, but by putting up the hedges and the what you can say the limited what you can say grazing lands, they try to restrict the movements of the peasantry, and their opposition or the resistance has also come up with regard to the peasantry parallelly in that sense as such. But the important thing is that we tried to find out that these resistance which have been there were basically meant for improving upon the conditions at the local level. We also try to see, as we discussed earlier, that the various environmental movement which took place in India, environmental movements which have been part of the Indian history. I think we have whole, what you can say, study, and what you can say, we all are aware about this Bhopal gas tragedy, where we have the leakage of the gas which has affected the population in terms of a long history, especially when we try to see that how it has affected the surroundings in that sense as such, especially this carbide plant which has been putting on risk to the people in and around in that sense as such. So we try to see that there need to be certain policies which are to have certain appeal for the industrial development. So industrial development should not be just closed, or it should not be one folded in that sense as such, rather it should keep in mind the interest of the local masses. It also tries to have certain amount of sociological imaginations, especially in terms of integrating how the human thoughts and the actions can be put together for the environment, and also how it is going to influence upon the human behavior. So we try to find out that both the issues can take place, like we have the Marxian interpretation in terms of exploitation, class struggle and the class conflicts, but on the contrary we also have to have certain amount of socialism which has to come up, which tries to overpower these particular issues. Then also we try to see that the Indian discourse, especially in terms of movement, is basically seen as a quest for the man and the nature relationship, which has to be seen in an organic way. And I think for that our historical leaders, like we try to speak about Mahatma Gandhi, or we try to speak about Rabindranath Tagore, they all has worked for, or they all have tried for making the Indian society more lively, like talking about the gram of the Swaraj, where the village is the center of the heart, or the Tagore's model of development, where the village are to be seen as the sites of development as such. So I think within that framework also we try to find out that the things which have happened were basically meant for putting people closer to the nature and in association with the nature, and that is how we try to see the issues of development. Now the Chipko movement, where we also have an appeal for the gender also, especially the women's, which have been part of the movement in a very active way, and they basically tries to what you can say, support and also conserve the forest at the cost of their own life. Similarly, if we try to see in relation to the Chipko movement, we also have the Apipko movement. Apipko movement, which is a protest at the Bethi Dam, which is also seen as a protest at the Bethi Dam in the southern India, and it has its inspirations from the Chipko movement itself. We have this Silent Valley project in Kerala, Silent Valley project in Kerala, which is another instance of what you can say, Kerala people's science movement for the whole issues. So virtually we try to see that these movements which are spread across the country are diverse in that sense as such, but the whole thing in that sense of course is that Indian scenario we have appeal for understanding the environmental issues in a very specific way, and I think we all will be benefited by this. This is not simply a question of teaching, but it is also the issue which pertains to that how we can have the sensitivity towards our surroundings. So with these words I will just stop it here, and I think further references which we can see is Ramchandra, the Unquaid Wood, and also we have Madhav Gadgil, Ramchandra Guha's further contributions, which can be seen as the significant contribution in the field of the environmental issues. And like we have also in the belly of the rivers or many other issues which is going to be part of the further readings that we can see further. So with these words I will say thanks, and we definitely will have interaction in different ways through these particular issues.